Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today I'm going to go to Vancouver and meet somebody to talk about water with. This is obviously a very stupendously important issue. The world's about to run out of water, but we're surrounded with it. So what are we going to do? My guest today is Professor Layla Harris, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia, and her main work has to do with water security, and especially, I guess, internationally. She seems to have traveled and written about many different parts of the world, and so we will cover the globe today. Hello, Layla. How are you?
Hi, Metta. I'm doing okay. Thank you.
Good. Okay. I don't know where to start because I just happened to have been a few minutes ago reading an article from the New York Times of a month or two ago about Iraq and the extreme water shortage that they're experiencing. Of course, they've been through ups and downs in the past, as when Saddam Hussein drained the marshes in the south and so on, but now they're going through something much worse. So I believe you've done a lot of work in the Middle East, right? Why don't you give me your take on how the world is going in terms of being able to manage the conflicts and the issues that have to be faced if water is to be allocated to people when they need it in sufficient quantities?
Mm-hmm. So I think your phrasing there captured what I think the key issue is. It's, are we able to do what's necessary in terms of managing, even in the absence of climate change and the sorts of uncertainty and hydrologic variability that we know is coming and is here and will increasingly intensify? We're not very good, actually, at that ability to think about the variability as part of the process. We often fix infrastructure and fix our goals as if the hydrology is fixed, and we know that it's not. So this is referred to in the literature in terms of what some people refer to as non-stationarity. It's not a station or fixed resource. And so a lot of our approaches need to shift and be more flexible. But the other key part of what you highlighted, I cannot recall the details of that Iraq story, even though I think I did see some of the imagery around it and some of what was conveyed, but it's oftentimes it is linked to other crises. So if we have a crisis of democracy, if we have political conflict, corruption in government, all of those things are often where we're going to see water scarcity in the most acute forms, unable to get water to people who need it for productive or household or drinking uses. So I'm very much interested, I study water. I don't study it biophysically. I don't do hydrologic models. I don't do engineering infrastructure, but I'm precisely interested in the sort of social and political issues that affect water and how we use or manage or govern it. And also how water can in turn affect politics. So just as one quick example, I have looked in the Tigris-Euphrates basin specifically around relationship to conflict, so I can speak to that in more detail. But our work in South Africa has also shown that whether or not people have access to services, water, that they find suitable and sustainable, or that they're satisfied with, is more the language we use, that actually affects their trust in government. And so that's not surprising at one level. If we think of it as a basic service and governments are unable to deliver it, that's going to affect our trust. But, this then shows how it impinges on all kinds of other issues, because trust in government is one of the basic features of democracy. If governments are doing their job, if they're transparent, accountable, and so forth. So this is one of the arenas where we can see a strong sense of citizens challenging the adequacy of governments when they can't deliver basic services. We saw very similar things in Flint, Michigan as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. Well, I was just wondering, people obviously would be suspicious of the government if they fail, but there's also the allegation, or I don't know, maybe that's too strong a word, the theory maybe that shortage of water is going to increase the number of wars because
Mhm.
people who don't get the kind of water that they think they're entitled to because another country is taking more than its share of the river or other source, that they're going to go to war over it. To what extent do you think historical facts have borne out that prediction? And if that's not relevant, to what extent do you think it's true?
Yeah. So I would say definitely water is intricately bound up with conflict. But we can unpack that further. I think a lot of the debates are often around this question of water wars. Will this result in wars between states or governments? And I think there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of analysis. Someone like Aaron Wolf has said, if we look at the historical record, we see many more instances of cooperation than we do of conflict. I think that that's true, but we also know that it's one of the key sources of instability. It's a key resource that governments want to capture as part of territory. And we've seen water be weaponized in many recent conflicts, including what's happening right now in Israel and Gaza. Israel has effectively cut off water and other essential resources to the population, even though that goes against humanitarian law, for civilians to cut them off from water and other basic needs. So I think there's a really complex, intricate relationship. The question of, is this going to be the primary driver that's going to lead to wars? Maybe not, but it's often going to be part of the interplay in terms of the sorts of things that territory, there's always been territorial efforts to extend, and water is often a key consideration, just as oil or other resources might be, in terms of why a government might aim to control or capture or occupy a particular territory. And, we do know that often it's used against populations. We've seen similar things happen in Ukraine as well. So there's a petition going on now that I've signed that's just sort of trying to highlight the situation both in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, to say that that's not appropriate, in any circumstance to cut off populations from water.
Well, absolutely. By any measure of human decency, it's terrible. The question, I guess, I'm not really on top of I don't follow it as close as I should, the Gaza thing, and but how much have they actually cut off? And isn't there any kind of international law that would? Of course, when you go to war, people don't follow international law very well anyway. But surely there must be basic rules of human rights that would say that people have access to water.
Correct. Yeah, there are. So it's stipulated in the case of wartime and conflict that you can't cut civilians off from water, I think, energy and food and other key resources. I don't have the name of the actual principle in front of me, but it's on the petition we just signed, so I could find it and share it with you very easily. But we also, at the UN level, and again, the question is always, do these UN resolutions have teeth, et cetera? How can they be implemented or also followed through? But there is also the human right to water, as enshrined in the 2010 UN resolution as such. And then a number of governments also have it in their constitutions. So I think, both in the wartime, but also in terms of the general principle of human right to water, we have that. In terms of the 2010 resolution, the idea is that there'll be progressive realization of the right, knowing that you can't just snap your fingers and say everybody's going to have access to safe water. And there are a lot of questions that leaves aside around affordability and other things, like what does the human right to water actually mean in terms of how you implement that in different contexts. So that's an open question in terms of what that actually looks like on the ground. One of the key research projects I've been working on for the past decade has actually been to take this broad idea of the human right to water that we've had for the past decade or more, and then to look at populations and their daily lives and to see how does this relate to what's actually happening for these communities on the ground. So take it out of the broad abstract policy space and look at the lived realities of people. So we've been doing work both in underserved communities around Cape Town, South Africa, and also around Accra, Ghana. Cape Town and South Africa has the constitutional right to water. There's no such analogous right in Ghana. But we're looking, at in these underserved, marginalized communities, how does this right play out discursively in terms of narratives and also in terms of reality? Does it actually make a difference in people's daily lives? To the degree that, again, you can't track it directly, but we can say, like, how does this play out? Like, what is happening in these most vulnerable communities? And I would say it does make a difference, for sure, both in terms of minimum access to water, but water is not only about minimum access. That's another key thing that I and other colleagues have been working on for some time. We often have this kind of notion, especially when we talk about the right to water, that it's a minimum number of liters per person per day. WHO and others often say 50 liters per person per day. But water is not just about basic survival. We are not just, animals who need to eat and drink, just to survive the next day. Water has a lot of meanings in our lives. It's linked to hygiene. It's linked to dignity. It's linked to senses of inequality in terms of people's experiences. It's linked to trust in government. So one of the things what we've been trying to do is flesh out, what does this mean for the human experience beyond this idea that, we just all need to survive to the next day, like beyond survival and basic needs in that sense. How does water play into our lives as social beings, as political beings, as emotional beings who experience the world in these ways? So we've been I've been part of a network of researchers, but also in several literatures. We've been thinking through those sorts of questions in terms of what else does this mean for people's lives and for the human experience and for, how we navigate the world.
I want to explore that in a minute, but if I want to switch back to something you mentioned about in 2010, the human right to water was introduced somehow. Now, I wonder if I had actually was involved in something that played into that. I'm not sure. That's about when I was very involved with an organization called Green Cross International, which was headed by Gorbachev in those days. And they had a meeting in someplace in northern Italy, near Bologna, I think. And I went there for a meeting on the human right to water. Remember, like 3 days, we had meetings on water there. Now, I think they were trying to get through some kind of resolution, and I don't remember what year it was. Could that have been part of the effort? And I guess what I want to ask is how this resolution was adopted. How did it come about? And that will help me try to figure out whether this meeting actually had any part to play in that. Development.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if it did, in that it's been a broad-based movement by activists and governments, from all corners. I didn't track historically how long or who was pushing the effort in different arenas. I just know that it was a long-term effort that was talked about in many years in water policy and activist circles. And then it took some time. There was a lot of ambiguity from a lot of key players, including the US and others. And then in 2010, the general resolution was adopted by the General Assembly. I know that Bolivia was a big player in that in terms of speaking on behalf of the resolution. I do think in the end, the US and several others abstained, but I can't remember precise pathways because it's been a decade since I looked at it carefully. Yeah. We wrote about it back in 2012, so over 10 years. I can forgive myself for not remembering all the details, but it was a big push, and a lot of people, especially in academic circles, are quite critical of the human rights discourse and framework. And I think they're not sure if it goes far enough, especially for certain communities, indigenous or other marginalized communities. And so I think, there's some interesting debates about how effective is it, how meaningful is it, especially when we know, sure, there's the right enshrined. There's a resolution that was adopted by the General Assembly, but what does it actually mean? And that's where it becomes harder to parse, because there's not necessarily specificity. It could still be out of reach in terms of affordability for people, even if it's technically available. How do you monitor that? There's a lot of questions. Generally, we look at the location of taps to say if countries are progressively realizing the human right to water, but we know just having a tap isn't enough because some people can't afford the connection fee, or there are cutoffs, or sometimes they're not working because of leakage or other issues. So, there's all kinds of ways, which is why I became interested in like the reality of people's lives instead of just talking about it in terms of numbers of taps, that we often see in the policy space. Because just using South Africa as an example, often South Africa is highlighted as one of the countries that's made the most progress. And a lot of the numbers look fantastic because it will be 96%, 99%. And in the communities where we've worked, which are Black townships outside of Cape Town, the numbers are actually quite impressive, again, in the 90s in terms of connections. And we also know it's affordable in some of the specific areas where we're working because it's at no cost. The water's being delivered. But, talking to people, you start to get a different appreciation. They will emphasize their concerns about hygiene because they have to go to a communal tap. They'll emphasize safety concerns because they have to be outside at night. Sometimes that's more for the sanitation for the toilets, perhaps. And then there's also these experiences of inequity, as I was speaking to before. The fact that the Constitution says that they have the right to water, again, not only in terms of a minimum sense, but it says all citizens have the right to equitable services. That has a lot of meaning for people, right? And they know that, yes, they can drink water. Yes, they have enough to survive. Technically, it's safe, but it doesn't map onto their notions and expectations of redress, of equity and dignity, and all the associated ways in which water impacts our lives and how we access water impacts our lives. So that's part of what I mean too. Like there's a minimum amount, which technically South Africa is meeting that requirement. People are not necessarily going thirsty or having to revert in these contexts. In other contexts it has happened, but revert to streams and other things where there might be health concerns, but they still have challenges, and there's still social and political aspects of their experience of water access and affordability that are important.
Now, when you say that a lot of I don't know, academics or somebody don't like or don't approve of the measure or don't think, is it because they don't think it goes far enough, or is it?
Yeah, they'll point to the inequities, like what I just said in Cape Town, that example I just gave, and they'll say, "See, South Africa has the constitutional right, but doesn't mean anything because we still have communities that don't have safe and affordable access." And that's true, but I do think it does, get us partway there. It's just not enough. So it's probably the idea that it's, maybe not sufficient to achieve everything that we hope for, but it's maybe one mechanism to partially get us there.
Okay,
that's my personal perspective that I've tried to write up in response to some of the critiques. Yeah.
That makes a certain amount of sense, but I would think that a lot of the real concern has to do with whether or not there's enough water to irrigate or to keep crops growing and produce food. Because, for example, in the story about Iraq, it's clear that those people are moving away now, moving into the cities or just unable to farm. Now, you can't measure that in terms of 50 liters per person. You've got to talk in terms of how you're going to divert, how much of the water you're going to divert before you turn the dam tap off or something, right?
Absolutely. So that's also taken as another critique of the human right to water. So again, that's one of the ones that I take a little bit more seriously, in that we don't want to just think about it in terms of minimal bodily needs, as I was saying, and as you said. So people talk about that in terms of productive needs, productive uses of water. So whether or not it's irrigation, then that links to food security, or, it could be in the case of the townships that I was talking about in Khayelitsha near Cape Town, people need water to run their car wash business or their economic livelihood. So the productive uses of water is a big consideration. And the other thing that the human right to water leaves aside, and again, this is what the critics point to, and it is important, are the ecological considerations and the non-human considerations, because obviously human right to water is very anthropocentric, human-centric. It's only as if humans matter. And there are requirements, of course, for rivers to be healthy and for other species, plants and animals. So now we've, in a governance sense, that's been relatively more recent to the scene. We talk about minimum stream flows and other things that we're now trying to institute and pay more attention to, because often there's been insufficient focus on those issues as well.
One of the things that puzzled me a few years ago, I believe there was a conflict in South America involving some city that I had never heard of. It starts with a C.
Cochabamba in Bolivia?
Yeah, all right. Now it had to do with the ownership of the water and the business of paying for it and so on. Can you recollect to my attention the nature of that conflict and how it turned out?
Yeah, I can in broad strokes. Again, it's not my area where I've done work, so I've just read secondary sources of other people's work. And again, I didn't prepare it, so it's not fresh. If I were a lecture, I would have made sure it's fresh. But basically, one of the big issues there that was a big concern was you had community systems that had been initiated and run by the community. And then they gave privatization contracts to the subsidiaries of some of the large water companies, and they were effectively locked out of their community systems as well. So the companies took control over the whole system, which included community systems that had been maintained and often, I believe, led and implemented by the communities themselves. So that really instigated a big conflict and pushback against the whole idea of privatization and the loss of rights and access. And in the end, again, I can't recall the details, but I think they were successful at canceling the move towards privatization in those contracts. The whole privatization debate is really interesting on so many levels. We saw it was largely in the 80s and early 90s. We saw a big push, especially in global policy circles, to involve the private sector more. And it was a sort of simplistic notion that this is a big, important issue. We need private sector investment and know-how to achieve these goals, is kind of the way it was framed at some of the World Water Forums and so forth. And so what really happened is a lot of communities, countries, some were forced through loan conditions. This happened in Ghana, to privatize their system. So it was a requirement given to them by World Bank or IMF or others. And, for the most part, the private companies were not very successful. Often we saw price increases. There was claims that they would reduce non-revenue water, which is the amount that's lost to leakage or other issues in the system or not paid for by consumers or users of the water, but often the numbers don't look that good. So in Ghana, as an example, I do remember and recall well, since I've studied there, they had 5 years with this a group that was managing as part of this privatization scheme. And, the numbers basically stayed the same in that 5 years. What they did do is install a bunch of costly meters in the system to go towards eventual metering. But they're not even in use. So there is sort of infrastructural investments that aren't necessarily that useful. And then Ghana, as soon as they were no longer required to go with those contracts, they forcibly pushed back and said, we want the system to be managed by Ghanaians for Ghanaians. Like, we want to center people's needs first and not business needs. And as you can imagine too, especially the initial contracts that were often negotiated were often very favorable to the businesses. They often had things to protect them in terms of currency instability, a number of other things that often then the countries, or ultimately the citizens of those countries, were on the losing end sometimes, because there was sometimes guaranteed profitability for the companies and other things that are sort of unheard of. So the companies often didn't take on much risk, in other words, but they were given very favorable terms. One of the things that happened in Ghana which just shows you how it wasn't a great deal from the Ghanaian perspective, is they did something called unbundling, which basically means they separated the urban water system from the rural for purposes of management. And the reason why is because it was the idea that the urban could potentially be profitable, or so they thought, but the rural, they knew that providing water in rural areas would not become profitable. So they basically separated the institutions that managed the two. And previously, you would have cross subsidization. So the urban would help fund the infrastructure required for the rural areas. But they were able to sort of hive off and sector off just the urban. So you no longer had this cross subsidization potential. So again, it became the burden of the Ghanaian government essentially to deal with the rural water. So that's just one example where they sort of fixed the terms to make it more beneficial and more potentially profitable for them. Even in the end, a lot of these schemes are not as profitable as they hoped, especially when you have a relatively poor consumer base.
Well, one of the things I'm puzzled about seems to me there is an almost built-in difficulty about pricing. How do you decide how much or whether even to charge people for water? If people have a human right to water, then at least some people are going to get it for free. That goes, I assume that just follows. If you can't pay for it, you're going to get it anyway. So how do you square that? How do you make sure that people are paying what they should or could for access to water appropriately, so that they don't just wind up turning on the tap and wasting everything? I assume that if things are free, people don't conserve properly. Is that a fair assumption, or is that some sort of elitist assumption of mine?
In general, that's probably fair, that there has to be some mechanism to make sure people are attentive to the use, because it is a costly service to provide. So I can give, different examples to speak to that. In South Africa, the way that they do it is there's a policy where if you don't have a certain amount of income, you would qualify to get a rebate or subsidy to be able to afford your water bill or to pay for your water bill or get it for free. And then they usually do what's called a block tariff structure, which means at the lower levels of consumption per unit, it might be cheaper. And then as you become a bigger and bigger consumer and consume more and more, the price per unit goes up. So that's a way for the people with more means, as you were saying. If you have a swimming pool or something where you're using a lot of water, again, you're going to end up subsidizing those people at the lower end of the tariff structure. So that's a common mechanism that's used. Otherwise there are coupons or grants or other things that you can use for your lower income users in the system. There's many different mechanisms. And so that's all different parts of cross subsidization schemes in terms of different needs or users. And you assume that if you're using above this amount, you're using it for your garden or for something else that maybe is something that everybody doesn't need per se. One of the things that, though, I've been thinking more and more about in the past years, it relates to what you're saying, but it's a little different. I have been arguing that water is a social good. And so what I mean by that is if we all have access to safe, affordable water, we all benefit. It's in no one's interest to have certain people left out of the system. It serves us all. So it's a collective need and a collective good. It really impinges on public health. So when you have an epidemic of cholera or something else, it's a big concern for the entire community. So I see it as a little bit akin, and because I'm from North America, I see it a little bit through the lens, and I'm from the United States as well, of, the way different issues are talked about in North America. I feel like by and large, even though there's some pushback, the argument is secure, and most people believe and understand why public education is so important. So you don't want to just leave it only to the people who can afford it to educate their children. We know societally we're all better off when children are educated, as a society. So I feel like there's really parallel arguments around what right to water. It's a worthwhile investment. Some economic analysis have told us that, for every dollar you invest in water infrastructure, I'm sure this is place and context dependent, but you'll yield $8 in benefits in terms of economic livelihoods, educational outcomes, because in certain countries, people can't go to school if they're having to provide and access to water and so forth. So on that like strict economic level, there's been studies that have shown the benefits of that investment, but also in all the other ways I was talking to that are more social and political. People feel more part of the community if they're able to access services like water in the way that other people do. Again, you can think of parallel ideas around education, that it really benefits people's sense of community and belonging when their kids are in school with all other children, regardless of their socioeconomic status. So I think there's a lot of arguments to be made just about the fundamental investment that societies collectively need to make in water. You see arguments, around some cities want to provide internet, for free for everybody in the city because they see that that's maybe an economic investment. So I think, the case is clear for me that water is one of those things that we should be providing to everybody to, have the economic benefits, but also the social benefits that come from that, and the health benefits in all those levels. I think it's quite clear.
There's no question, I suppose, to anybody's mind if you just think twice. But
but it doesn't enjoy the same way that the discourse or people, don't think necessarily that that's a good investment. Like we're always debating, let's give it to the private companies. There's not this idea of a collective need always. Sometimes there is, but I feel like right now, especially in countries like Canada and the US, we have a lot of aging infrastructure, and we need to be making those decisions soon about how are we going to re-up the infrastructure and make sure that people have good quality, affordable water. And I think these are going to be big questions in front of us.
Well, okay. But, that assumes that there is a possibility of solving the problem, that the technology can do the trick. But I keep hearing about the world running out of water because for example, the glaciers are melting and will not be feeding into the rivers, although they're feeding fine now that they're melting, but they won't after the ice is all gone and so on. And so I guess my question is, globally, is there any solution? Are we facing something that current technological status can't manage? Or do we have the possibility of doing desalination on such a scale as to make up for the deficit of water in places like the Indus River? And I think that's one of the places where there's a dispute over who gets how much of the water from different countries and so on. What's the technological prospect of being able to solve the global problem of shortage of water compared to growth of population?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting question. And there's so many different ways we could go at that. We have the technology to treat water. We have the technology to treat water. I'm just talking about drinking water in this instance, not all the other productive uses, irrigation and so forth that you mentioned, which again is a bigger issue, especially when water scarce regions, when you're losing snowpack and all the things you mentioned. But just to give an example, we can do quite inexpensively what they call a closed loop system, which would be treating our wastewater to be able to drink it again. But again, that's a very technological vision about water. And so I don't want to allow us to go down a route where we're not thinking about the streams and the health of the streams, the health of the waterways. Are the waterways replenished enough to maintain the salmon and the other species that depend on those waterways? So yes, I believe in the technology. I think a lot of our failures are on the governance side, because of all the governance failures that we have. But, I don't want to go down just like a techno solution pathway, because then we miss so many things that are important about water in our lives and in our ecosystems. And water is a strong signal in terms of our failure to protect and manage all ecosystems effectively. The whole climate change debate, everything that you said about the melting of the snowpack and glaciers. So all of these are going to challenge us more and more. Water is available. It's just not always available when and where we need it, right? So it's a question then of, is it going to be increasingly expensive? Is it going to, the haves and the have-nots are going to become even more important in that future where it's harder to get water or more expensive to transport and treat water? So I'm really concerned about a vision that's, too reliant on technology, but we know to this point, we've had the technology and we still can't necessarily get water to people when and how they need it. So, I usually am focused on the governance side. I'm not someone who does the management technology. And I could just say, if we look historically, we know that technology is not enough. And towards the future, I'd like us to have a more holistic perspective as well, and not just
But is there, is it even technologically possible to do enough desalination to actually, irrigate?
Yeah, so it's technologically possible. It's just economically not feasible because
let's combine them. Is it
Yeah,
practical?
It's not practical. It's not practical for that reason. And so unless the technology can shift so we can rely more on desal, then it raises some other issues just in terms of, again, do we care? There's some work that I've done with a postdoctoral scholar in Chile, and I'll just share this example with you because I think it really highlights what I'm concerned about or what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. In the Chilean case, the mining companies have said to the government, we would like a permit to use this water. And a lot of the mining happens in the high mountains, as it does in a lot of other places. And they said, what we'll do so that you'll give us this permit to get the water is we will desalinate. We'll pay for desal so that the same amount of water is brought to consumers in the system. So it sounds like a good deal. Okay, they're going to pay. But they're using desalination down at the coast where some of the population centers are more. So it's, again, there's an efficiency here. So they can pay for it where it's needed by those consumers. But they're using pristine mountain stream water, and polluting that waterway, which again has a lot of implications for the broader ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So if we allow ourselves to see it too narrowly as like just human drinking water, is the technology sufficient? Technically the technology is sufficient. Mm-hmm. They can replenish the system with the same amount of water that they're using, but it's not a good deal when you think about that case because of geographically where the water is, the type of water in a mountain freshwater stream, relative to the desal, which is less desirable anyway to drink. There's all kinds of trade-offs we're making all the time. And, if we're too focused on our ability to replenish, then we're going to lose sight of what we need to do to maintain the sources that we have and protect them. So, that's very concerning to me as someone who cares, again, about the whole ecosystem and a broader perspective of health, and not just do I get enough drops of water in my mouth to survive, in a very technical, limited sense, but how do we interact in the world around us, with other non-humans and nature, excuse me. So those are the things that I would like us to keep our focus on.
I would think that if you work in a particular area, you can talk about this particular local issue of how to manage this stream and all that, those things. But can you come up with any kind of global plan or general rule of a macro level, a solution that would have any overall impact over the kinds of problems that you've been mentioning, the desirability of keeping your streams and running clean and a place for the fish to live and so on. Is there any kind of structural global treaty or something that could be developed that would overall have a massive impact on problems at that level?
Probably the most important at this point in time would be climate change related treaties and agreements, because that's where we're going to see the most challenge. And already the floods and droughts, that we're seeing now. We used to talk, 20 or 30 years ago, we used to talk about 2050, 2030, 2050, being these timeframes where we might start to see challenges with climate change. But the truth is we've seen it now. We've seen a lot of stress and water scarcity, as with the Iraq example you gave, but many others. We know, going back to the conflict discussion we started with, water scarcity was one of the issues that led to instability in Syria with that conflict some years ago. And we know it's just one of the things that's not allowing people to live full lives, that are in the economic sense, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of food security. So I would say, is there a piece of legislation, anything that relates to the climate change agreements and, actually making progress would be really key at this stage to move us in that direction. And in the more narrow water realm, water is linked to energy, food, and all the other things we've discussed briefly. But in the more narrow water realm, I would focus my effort on anything that facilitates an understanding about water as embedded in broader ecosystem health, and or anything that facilitates, our ability to govern water for equity and more effectively, to not have it be captured by elites or to be seen as something that in the interest of private companies or, anything that kind of maintains that social and equitable understanding of water. So those would be the two things I would hope for most. One is more epistemological or ontological in terms of how we understand water and how we think about it in terms of a policy question. And the other is, I think, just through the climate change challenges that are going to just become more and more difficult.
Right there. The prospect is, it's not going to good.
Yeah.
Not going to get easier.
Correct.
I diverted you a long time ago from where you were about to tell me about your study of the narrative that people have about water in their lives in, I guess, South Africa and Ghana. Is that right? So I apologize for taking.
I don't remember.
Can we go back and hear a little bit about your research?
Yeah. So we've looked at again everyday experiences with water insecurity. And some of that work has taken place in Ghana and South Africa. And then I'm part of this broader network that anthropologists, geographers, sociologists, and others who are working on water insecurity experiences throughout the world. And I guess the sort of key insight that I sort of have mentioned in different ways is that water is a lot more meaningful in people's lives than just, can I drink and, am I satiated and not thirsty? It really affects their sense of justice. My colleague Farhana Sultana has done work in Bangladesh around the arsenic crisis. Mm. She and my other colleague Amber Wuttich have really documented the stress that people feel on a daily basis when they're not sure where they're going to get water the next day. So, that is about securing water, but in those cases, it's often linked to responsibilities maybe of mothers to provide for their families and their children. So they feel like they're not meeting their obligations as a mother to their children. And so these multiple layers at which the stress is felt and experiences or the worry. So Amber Wuttich's work in Bolivia, actually related to the Cochabamba case that you mentioned, is women really documented a lot of stress and worry and negative mental health outcomes when they had to barter on a daily basis for the price of water with a vendor. And also when they perceived it to be inequitable, they had a lot more stress and worry about water. So those are just like some of the ways in which the social experience about water, how if we understand how people talk about water, they're never going to talk about water just in terms of H2O, but it's going to bring in all those social relationships, their responsibilities as mothers or to their communities, or what is their relationship like with the vendor, and how does it feel to have the price change on you on a daily basis so that you can't plan? Mm-hmm. Those are the types of layers that as a collective, I think we've been able to really speak to. Mm-hmm. And Amber Wuttich, who's been one of our key people in the network, was just named as a MacArthur Genius Award, MacArthur Fellow. So that's really exciting.
What did she do that was different?
She's just been amazing in terms of doing long-term work on these questions and helping lead intellectually in terms of, what this looks like to think about water and the social experience in these different ways. Mm-hmm. She's also led a lot of innovative projects that are cross-cultural. So trying to think methodologically about how we can do better cross-cultural comparisons and so forth. Mm-hmm. So she's been really a key driving force among our colleagues.
To what extent could you say that the method of agriculture could be improved in a way that would make a significant difference in water security? Enough, for example, the article about Iraq said that there's certain areas where they're using methods of agriculture that are 6,000 years old and definitely not efficient. They flood the fields, I gather, and that's just not the way to do it. I've heard of something I don't think I've ever seen any example of it, but what is this drip agriculture?
Drip
Uh,
irrigation, yeah.
yeah. Now, is that I presume that's like a garden hose with a lot of leaks in it at the right
That's
place.
pretty much correct.
Something that,
Yeah,
and you do this in order to conserve the amount of water, make sure that whatever comes leaking out goes where it's needed, right?
correct.
Is there enough difference made from using that kind of agriculture so that spreading it or making sure that it's adopted generally would make a significant difference? Or is this just kind of a little idle, strange quirk? Like another strange quirk that I'd like to see if you mention is catching water out of the air, putting up big nets and letting it capture clouds. And I've seen that. I believe it happens, but I imagine you can't do it everywhere in the world. So, are any of these, new technological tricks worth attention?
Yeah. So I do know about the first topic because my dissertation was on irrigation in Southeast Turkey. And, they were also doing the sort of flooding that you mentioned in terms of the crops in the fields. So drip irrigation is definitely a big water saver. And, that's one of the ways in which Israel has reduced the percentage of water in the agricultural sector relative to a lot of other countries. So it is possible, as you said, not to be distributing water where it's not needed. So you go directly to the plants, and then you can also time it in a way that's more useful for the crop and its particular needs. So that is one thing. Again, I'm not sure what are the challenges in terms of economic or other challenges, why it hasn't been implemented more in different contexts. But, I think there is some space there, of course, for improvement. But the linked question is also really what we're growing, where, and for what purposes. So a lot of what we grow, for instance, in Turkey, when they brought irrigation on, yes, they were pushing drip irrigation in terms of the government doing demonstration farms to show farmers how much more efficient that was to do those different technologies. But I think you have to look at the question of cropping. So most farmers, because of viability economically, were switching their crops from food, from lentils, grains, and pulses to cotton. Most of the cotton is then being produced for consumption in the textile industry, going to Germany and Europe and the United States. Most of those textiles are consumed, in low cost clothing for people in the fashion industry, or the low, I forget what the low fashion industry is called, but just for mass consumption. So I think there's these bigger questions about, like, is that the most efficient use of the water in southeastern Turkey? When people maybe are relatively impoverished, maybe food crops are more reasonable rather than producing cotton for export. Cotton's a very water consumptive and also input consumptive crop. So you need a lot of pesticides and other things as well, generally, and a lot of labor also to grow cotton. So I think, again, it just raises bigger questions about what if we were growing things more for food security and less for consumption, so we could go and buy cheap clothes, at a large box store. How are those decisions made? Well, they're not really decisions any of us are making directly, but they're sort of through the market. They're more indirect. And I think that's where we actually have a lot of inefficiencies just in the system, because we have incentives to grow for export, because consumers are willing to pay for certain things. But, in terms of, are we meeting needs of people around the world? There are huge inefficiencies just in terms of inequities in those systems. And inefficiencies, I mean, by people in North America can consume that much more because they have access to new cheap cotton sources, to allow us to buy $5 t-shirts. So, to me, that's also an inequity in a different way, and it relates to how we're consuming the water in specific locales, and, what needs are being met by that consumption. There was a theorist who talked about this, Tony Allen, who passed away fairly recently, but he used to talk about virtual water in that way. So if we can link it to how water is being exported in the forms of crops or products, who's consuming it? And,
Sorry, let me play with that idea. Virtual water, meaning how much water is actually involved in what this scarf I'm wearing.
Correct.
That to produce it, certain amount. Oh goodness, I haven't. That's an
Yeah, so
interesting
almonds
question.
are a example that people talk about a lot. And so to me, it was the counterexample that immediately came to mind when you were asking about drip irrigation. We're growing a lot of almonds in California and other
Mhm,
places that are also experiencing water insecurity of different
mhm,
types.
mhm,
And, I think almonds are lovely. I love almonds, but, what are
mhm.
who's consuming them? The almond milk craze, who's getting to benefit from those crops? How is it affecting the local ecology or hydrology? And is it the most appropriate crop to be growing there? How does it benefit food security, either locally or globally? So I think, and rice is another one sometimes people point to in terms of the water consumptive aspects of rice. And of course, these are all cultural foods that can be very important in certain cultural contexts. But I think there are a lot of questions that we can think about more broadly in terms of crops. And I forget the numbers, but for almonds, if you look it up, like how many gallons of water goes into one almond or something, it's extraordinary.
I have heard that. It really
So,
makes me guilty. Yeah, because
so I think those questions really need to be asked. Like, why are we producing and consuming in certain places for certain consumers? And what would it mean to challenge or try to think
a
differently?
whole different discussion of a real change in the economy. If you start talking about how you're going to make decisions of scale of that
Yeah,
kind, when
yeah.
we're not going to produce almonds anymore, then that's a different. You're really changing out of the market system, and
Right. And so when I answered climate change to your question of what would be the most effective shift, certain other people would have said capitalism, is a big thing that's
sure.
really pushing us in the wrong direction on a lot of these questions around water and consumption and production. So
No,
because
I don't believe
they're
that because I mean, only thing is if you compare it to what are you going to compare it to? Socialism? Well,
well,
you
that's
look at how efficient, socialist, at least communist countries were, and just look at the Aral Sea, for example. I mean, that was not done
it
by
just raises
capitalism.
the question, though, about the fact that these are decisions that are also made by not making decisions about them. So we're allowing the market forces and consumers in faraway locales to make
Mhm.
decisions and impinge on different localities. So I think that's the question that comes to more to the forefront for me when we highlight capitalism in terms of how market shifts, exports, pricing, all of that can really have these cascading effects that are not, direct choices that people are making, around the ecologies and communities where they live and work. So that's where I think it does raise some really challenging and important questions.
Very interesting. Do you deal with things like far out new ideas of how to restructure the economy so as to get rid of the waste of producing almonds?
I don't. Some other people I think do. One of the ways, the more far out things that I do is I really appreciate work by artists and some feminist humanities scholars and others, which is more about rethinking our relationship to water. So
Mm-hmm.
that was some of what I was signaling earlier about, like, that this is fundamental to how we relate to the places where we live and the other animals and the trees and other species and so forth. And so I often return in my mind to that more basic question of maybe if we could think about our relationship differently, and water allows us to think through that, we would have a different relationship to these questions. So I'll stick on this for one more minute. Astrida Namanis, who's a colleague at UBC Okanagan, has done really fabulous work that's very impactful for me personally and in my work, where Astrida writes that, our bodies are porous. 70% of our bodies are water. What enters our body from the ecosystem affects our bodily health, and what leaves our body and goes back to the waterways, affects the waterways. And so what Astrida says, if we could really center water more in our lives and understand that we are not individual beings, but we're part of this collective, that goes to that collective spirit I was talking about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
that includes not only other people, it does connect us to other people, but it also connects us to the ecologies, the other species and the plants that depend on the same waterways. Maybe we would have a different relationship to water, but also like shift our whole understanding of ourselves in relation to those communities. And, water really makes apparent the way we are connected, just as COVID made apparent, through our breath and sharing breathing space, that we're all connected and the health of one is connected to the health of all. And if we just really attend more to how we're polluting the waterways or affecting those streams and so forth, that it ultimately affects us and our health, and moves through our bodies, maybe it gives us a different sensibility or orientation to the world around us. So to me, that's very powerful. And it's not just a metaphor, it's literally the way our, water moves through us and our porous bodies, and it kind of breaks us down.
I love it as poetry. I'm trying to see if you communicate.
Quite literal as well, though. It is literally true.
Well, I'm sure it's true. The question is, if I were to be a born again water lover, as whatever you're trying to promote here, which I think I'm in favor of, but I don't quite understand it. How would my life be different? In what way would you say that I would function differently if I had a better appreciation of the importance of water as uniting us all as one part of one big system?
I think there's at least 2 or 3 different levels where it could affect us. I've noticed, again, maybe especially in North America, sometimes people do have a very individualistic focus, in terms of, well, this doesn't affect me or my household, therefore it's not important. And I think it does give us a different politics where we care about what's happening to others around us because we understand how fundamentally connected we are. And again, COVID made us that more real for us in a different way, right? We knew that.
No, it didn't.
It did, in the sense that, at least in terms of the illness, not in terms of how it affected us.
It should have made us all more aware of, you can't just look after your own health. You have to look after other people's health too, because you can't separate yourself. It should have. But if anything, more people into selfishness, I think, than had been the case.
I'm thinking more about the airspace and that we just sort of knew how connected we were to the health of others. But I do think like maybe it would make us more oriented to justice considerations and what is happening. But the other thing that I think makes it true in the more water realm, and this people in public health talk about this as One Health is the term that they use.
Yes.
It moves us away from this idea like, okay, as long as we can treat the water, we don't care what we're letting the mining companies do upstream. Like that's how we've been operating, because we have this notion like, well, we can take care of it here. We have the engineering capacity or we have the funds to treat it. But I think if we had that different sensibility that I take Astrid is asking us to think through, we would understand more that it's not healthy for the waterways or the bear or the salmon, and that, our health is also affected and linked. And so it's not sufficient to just say, do whatever you want. You can deforest, you can mine. We'll just rely on our treatment, at our tap, because it would have that broader relationship to water, a broader appreciation that our healths are interconnected and that we need to maintain the ecosystems. And the best way to secure tap water, safe water for us to drink, is to have safe water sources. I mean, that's undeniable.
Yes.
If we have unsafe sources, we can still have illness and disease that comes through our waterways. If we treat it, it's more expensive to treat the more challenges you have from the source water. So in multiple levels, like I think it would maybe shift our focus in terms of what we should be doing and how it affects us individually and collectively. I think there's some other more spiritual and or
I'm sure you're getting there.
Ways that it could affect us too. But
the spiritual angle is coming through already.
But it's a different sense of spirituality in terms of like that, in the same way we can appreciate that our lives are a blip on this earth, or like we're only one of many when you look at the stars, but that sense, but it's a different orientation, I think, to the world around us and what
Indeed, that's absolutely wonderful to contemplate. We need to do another show just to talk about the interconnectedness of all life beings. And our time is up, but this has been a good introduction to whatever new spiritual practice you're promoting, which I'm interested in adopting. I'm I'm already a good candidate for your. It's been fun. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you.
All right, good wishes. Keep up the wonderful work. You're fixing us all, helping. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Project Save the World produces these forums, and this is episode number 574. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces